Today on the Camera Journal podcast, I'm joined by Ben Guttman. He's the author of Simply Put, Why Clear Messages Win. He's a marketing and creative expert in fabulous New York City. And we're going to find out all about messaging and marketing and what his unique perspective is. So, welcome, Ben, to the Camera Journal podcast.
Thanks for having me, Cameron. Great to be here.
Thank you. All right. So, why don't we start off right from the beginning? Tell us a little bit about yourself and your book.
Absolutely. Again, my name is Ben Guttman. I wrote my book called Simply Put, Why Clear Messages Win and How to Design Them. Came out just last year. But prior to that, I ran a marketing agency for 10 years. It was called Digital Natives Group. We had all sorts of fun clients. I started that in an old professor's basement. And, we drove my 1994 Honda Accord to his office and slapped our logo on the wall. And that was, the beginning of our journey that eventually led to working with the NFL and I Love New York and all these really wonderful clients over the years. Sold that about 2 years ago. Since then, I've been teaching, I've been writing, I've been doing other consulting work. And one thing that kept on coming up was the same problem that I would see in my classroom where students were curious about what works and what doesn't work. I would see in the boardroom with our clients in terms of them saying, well, what makes for an effective campaign? What's going to be an effective message here on our website or on social media or whatever it's going to be? And I would see that as a kind of user of the world too, that we had this really tough challenge of people who had things that were really cool and important and vital to communicate, but were unable to do it. Right? They were unable to kind of get the message across in a way that actually informed and actually persuaded. And so I began to look into this more and more, and that's what led me to the ideas behind Simply Put, which is that, well, the messages that are effective are the ones that are simple. And that's not particularly revelatory, right? But what do we mean by simple? Is an important distinction. How do we get there? What is the mechanism of which this works? All of this was surprisingly deep and complex, paradoxically, and that ultimately makes it less of a one-page book and more of the 208 pages that the whole thing ended up being.
Yes, definitely. Well, I would say in writing you definitely accomplished your goal by keeping the book relatively short, which was nice. So what is it about simple messages that work so well?
So, there's this idea of the word fluency. And we've heard the word fluency before in our lives, right? You can be fluent in English or Spanish or Mandarin. You can be fluent in cheese. You can be fluent in a television show. Where things are easy, things are fluent. That's what it means in kind of common parlance. And that's related to what a behavioral scientist or a cognitive scientist would say if you ask them about the word fluent. What they mean by fluency is how easy is it for you to take something from out in the world, stick it in your head, and make sense of it? Right? How easy is it for you to process a message, to perceive that message, and to make really use of that message? So, what happens, and this is through all sorts of different mechanisms, all sorts of different stimuli. When something is easier for us to perceive and to understand, we like it more, we trust it more, and we buy it more. All the things that we want when we're talking about, being in advertising and marketing or just being in leadership in general. Now, the opposite of that is also true, which is that if it takes us a lot of work to read something, to hear something, to understand it, well, what that means then in practice is that we don't like it, we don't trust it, we don't buy it. All the things that we obviously want to avoid when we're in that situation. So
Yeah, I want to talk
yeah.
about that for a moment
Mhm.
because in a weird way, you're totally right. I mean, absolutely. The Cameron Journal brand is about taking very complicated things, making them very simple. It literally says the world is complicated. This is not right at the top. Um, but I love old advertising. And there's a beautiful shop in the basement of Pike Place Market in Seattle that has torn apart magazines and they sell them as one pages, and I own several of them. And and a lot of them are from the early 50s. So I have a Chrysler ad from 53 called The First Family of Cars. Um, I have one from 58 about the Buick Roadmaster, that I have posted ironically, and it's called The Rights of a Sovereign Man. It's so misogynistic. It's so 1950s. And I have it as a kind of, it's kind of a tongue-in-cheek joke, but the ads are very beautiful and they make great for wall display sort of thing. So much text. There's a lot of information there. Um, and and when I teach advertising, I talk about how we moved from an age of text information informing to thoughts, feelings, vibes, symbols, impressions, more of a visual language, less of a written language, less
Mhm.
intellectual sort of thing. Um, why do you think, in the 60 years since then, why do you think we moved from an advertising that really used linguistics and language to get their point across, as opposed to advertising that is more about the feeling, the visual, the vibe, and
Mhm.
the subtle messages?
It's funny you mention those old advertisements because I actually make the argument that um, that we're probably going to come around full circle to a lot of that stuff at some point. So um, if you look at how marketing, really advertising, has worked in the past 20 years or so, it's basically been, there's been a lot of stuff around the edges, but the stuff that really is like where all the money goes and where all the, product actually really moves is from targeted online advertising. Like so what that means, that's Google, that's Facebook, and to a lesser extent, that's Amazon. Those three companies, and I forget what the exact number is for this year, but as of like a year or two ago, it was like those three companies are 49% of the entire advertising industry. Like everything, like billboards,
Yeah.
commercials,
Killed the newspaper.
magazines. Yeah,
Yeah.
newspapers. All of that is the same as just those three companies that are vying for our eyeballs on the internet. So
Right, right, right.
how do those companies work? Is they basically are able to, in a nutshell, they're kind of able to track your behavior around the internet, slice and dice you into all sorts of different types of demographic groups, interest groups, psychographic groups, geographic groups, and say, okay, well, this person is the most likely person to be interested in hiking boots at this moment, right? And so we're going to serve them the hiking boots advertisement. And we're going to, once they see that advertisement, once they click on that and maybe go shopping for it, we're going to hit them over the head again and again and again and again in that. And that model is very effective. But it's kind of like a blunt force object, right? You kind of basically get hit over the head a lot of times. It's by really targeting in on the right person at the right time, uh, and kind of repeating your message over and over. And to an extent, it really doesn't almost matter what your message is. It does, but like it matters a lot less what your message is in that scenario than it does when you're advertising a little more broadly. And the problem is for advertisers is that kind of the age of tracking is really kind of beginning to fade. So the death of the cookie is the little, for anybody who doesn't know, it's the little digital file that tracks you around the internet. That this has been kind of shuttled along to the end of its life here by Google, by Apple, by Mozilla, and something in, like, for instance, one day a couple of years ago when Facebook first reported earnings that were after this this big kind of change, their stock price dropped by 20%, right? Because everybody saw the writing on the wall and said, okay, well, if I'm not able to kind of beat
Yeah,
people over the
well, a
head with this stuff.
pile-on regulation by the EU, Apple's new
Hmm.
privacy things that had an adverse effect on Facebook. All of a sudden, this stuff is not as effective as it used to be. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And so what my argument is that because we're not able to do this like shortcut to basically, persuade by slicing and dicing a blunt force, we have to go back a little bit to some of the creative messaging, the skills that were on display in those ads that you're talking about. And I think that's one of those things that's harder. It's harder to write a really great piece of copy to write a
Oh,
message.
people that used
Yeah.
to do that content were paid a
Yeah.
lot of money. I mean,
Hmm.
they were, back in the days of Madison Avenue when those ads were created, Madison Avenue was at its height. A good copywriters, were worth their weight in gold. If the person, if you had the Chrysler Motors account in 1953 when that first family of cars ad was created, um, how good that copy was would make or break whether that account continued with you. A copywriter leaving could be devastating. Watch Mad Men, everyone. Go watch Mad Men.
Oh yeah.
Sort of thing, That's yeah, I mean it would absolutely it was and I remember when I first started, my background is in freelance writing. When I first started doing that, I was still writing text for print mail campaigns. This was how long
Hmm.
ago that was, which is funny, but back in 2005, print mail advertising still mattered. Um, and that getting that absolutely right and having it convert because of the expense and having it right. If you were the person that could sit down and give them, 300 to 500 words on their product and it actually sold something, that was your business.
Oh yeah.
Like, and there were people that made six figures and that's all they did.
Hmm.
That's long gone now, but when I was getting into that was my goal. I wanted to become one of those people. The industry died before I ever got there, but that was the goal. And so,
That's the, I mean, that's the Don Draper archetype, right? Like
yeah.
it's if when people ask me a lot of times like what's the most influential book, what's the best book you can read on marketing, I don't tell them, like something that came out 2 years ago talks about social media. I point to Ogilvy on advertising, which is sitting on my shelf right over there, and the examples are going to be sometimes humorous because they're things from 40, 50, 60 years ago. But when you look at how when you look at how technology changes, that changes very fast. When you look at how humans change, we change very slow, right? We're still the same, same people that we were 100 years ago or 100,000 years ago, and we basically respond to things in the same way. So the principles of persuasive writing, the principles of clear communication that worked then still work now. We just have a lot of other kind of shiny objects that often distract us from that.
No, I get that. I definitely get that. No, um I was teaching a class on marketing and advertising to small business owners a couple years ago now, and I start by watching a lot of old TV ads, which honestly some I it's getting long enough now. I need to drop off some of the older ones and bring in some newer ones because they're a lot of them are less relevant than they used to be. Um, but one person I remember having the aha moment when one person said, "Why do I always hear that music? I always think of flying," and it was Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue. I said, "Because United Airlines has made that song synonymous with them, and that's why you think of flying. They have spent ungodly amounts of money, one, owning the rights to that song, and two, putting it in every single bit of advertising for the last 40 years. So every
Mm.
time you hear it, you associate it with air travel. That's the only reason why. The song has nothing to do with air travel. United Airlines has spent loads making sure that you associate it with them, and at least in
Mm.
your mind, it's at least become associated with air travel. Um, and I have several of their old ads from the 90s in the group of ads that I do to talk about advertising and what works and what doesn't and why. Um and yeah, it's a very interesting sort of thing that something that simple, a sound. It didn't quite connect to the United would be very sad that they didn't think of United when they thought of that, but merely air travel.
Yeah.
But I mean, but that's one of the things of kind of like to talk about the human brain changes very slowly. It's that sound association of a very specific activity, a very specific sort of thing.
Hmm.
And I love you talking about that because I always make the joke that humans were programmed 100,000 years ago and the devs have not been seen since. There have been no updates pushed. Nothing has,
Yeah.
it is exactly the same.
I
Um,
love that analogy. Real quick before you move on, so I'm
yeah,
so happy you mentioned Rhapsody in Blue. This is a bit of an aside, but when I was writing this book, so have you ever heard of the Pomodoro method?
yes, yeah,
So
yeah.
so that's the 25 minutes on, 5 minutes off, type of timer thing if we're doing productive work.
Right.
That's never really worked for me. It's worked in tiny, bits and starch, but the Rhapsody in Blue method is what I coined it for me, which is if I needed to get something done, writing this book or doing research or whatever, I would put on Rhapsody in Blue. It would be 15 or 16 minutes long, and I would power through that next chapter with that. And I still had the momentum. I would put on the next Gershwin song, which is An American in Paris. And so you can put 30 minutes of concentrated, focused work just by listening to those two songs.
No, that's perfect. Yeah, I've struggled with the Pomodoro method on my own. For me, it works better with like other people. Like I used to go to these online hangouts. This was before COVID. Online hangouts to work on stuff and do different things because I was working on multiple books and all this sort of thing. And it on my own completely doesn't work.
Yeah.
With if I'm in a group of people like on Zoom or on Discord or whatever have you, it works way better. Um,
Hmm.
and I think it's like I'm autistic and have ADHD. I think it's a body mirroring thing. Um, so but yeah, it's no, it's really fun, but it's yeah, advertising is like the diff all those sights and sounds and texts and sayings. The same thing with brands that become verbs, Xerox,
Yeah.
Kleenex. Well, I remember when I was in Britain, I was in the kitchen, I was wrapping up some food, and I said, "Do you have any Saran wrap?" Which is not what it's called. That's the brand.
Yeah.
Um, and we stood there for a second, and he's like, "Are you talking about cling film, clear and
Hmm.
plastic? That's the stuff." Because in Britain that wasn't the brand that came out that brought it to Britain in the 60s. So they all call it cling film because it's a thin film and it clings to stuff. Makes sense. Um, I mean, and that's, very rarely do companies get that. Google, I think, was the last one where Googling something became a verb. It's very rare that their brand becomes so ubiquitous that it
Hmm.
becomes a verb, regardless of what service you're using, whatever have you. It becomes the term to define a thing, you
You
know.
notice a lot of companies don't, they want that to an extent, but then they don't want it after a certain point because then you start to lose the trademark, actually. So that's been a big
Right.
thing. Uh,
Yeah.
I forget, I don't know if they lost the trademark or not, but dumpster is a trademark or originally was a brand name, right? Um, and that's one of those things where everything's a dumpster, right? There's
Yeah.
um
I didn't know
and
that. That's
yeah.
fascinating. Yeah. Hmm. No, I mean, but they're ever. I mean, it's surprising. It's kind of everywhere, sort of
Hmm.
thing. Tupperware suffers from the same thing. Any plastic container is people will call it Tupperware, even though when was the last time you ever saw real Tupperware, sort of thing.
Hmm.
But that is one of those. It's become the weight. That in that case an adjective to describe any plastic container you put food in.
Oh yeah.
um because it's become again so ubiquitous, and I agree that one definitely does have diminishing returns because it compromises all your trademarks.
Oh
I
yeah.
forget, there's somebody in court right now who's trying to fight that. I don't remember who. If I had been smart, I would have looked up before I started
Yeah.
this. There's someone in court right now trying to fight that.
So every
um
like you'll never see Google, at least in the last decade or so. You say Google something, right? They always say use like Google search, like search is the product, right?
right.
But when you're not there, so Bing famously, we have a bunch of cringy product placement over the like 2000s and 2010s, which had people on TV shows and movies saying, "Oh, just Bing it," right? Nobody ever says that in real life, but they wanted people to say that instead of Googling it. But they, of course, never reached the point where it was so ubiquitous that they lost control over the trademark.
Yes. um yeah, although interestingly enough, now with the AI assistant, Bing is finally hitting its stride,
Yeah.
which I think is funny in that it was not any bit of marketing or advertising. It was a change of experience, you
Hmm.
know. And that's why I always say, regardless of what kind of advertising you do, the cream rises to the top. People figure out what's good and what's not pretty fast. It doesn't take them long. Yeah, and that's why I always say the best marketing advertising will never cover up for a bad product, ever, you know.
Hmm.
I mean, even with something like the Pet Rock, at least it was what was on the box. You Pet Rock here, there's the rock, like sort of,
Yeah.
sort of thing. It would be very awkward if the box said Pet Rock and they'd advertised it and there was nothing inside, or something else. Um, So yes, if whatever it is not quality, there's no marketing advertising that's going to fix that problem. So the other thing I want to kind of bounce off of that in terms of simple messaging and all this type of thing is people for whom the marketing and advertising goes wrong. And there are many, many examples, but I would like to know what is your favorite, maybe some of your favorite campaigns that, oh my goodness, if they had talked to literally anyone on the street for 5 minutes, they would have told them this was a terrible idea and to please start over immediately. Because I have
Oh.
my pet ones, but you go first.
I always have a hard time thinking of these because they're so often so bad that I end up kind of, squirreling them away in the part of the brain that shouldn't that I don't want to remember it. But there
Yeah.
is one that I think is um, a recent offender when it comes to simplicity. And that was, are you familiar with the AI pin that was going around? Let me make sure I forget that. From Humane. So
Oh, yes,
it's the
yes,
little
yes.
thing that like attaches to your lapel and like
Yes,
projects
I
onto your
saw that
hand.
on TikTok a while ago, and that
So
was, oh my goodness, yes.
so if you saw on TikTok, you might have seen the founders did a um, they did a little like demo video that was kind of introducing the product. And it was terrible. It's a case study in bad communication. Because I have kind of five principles in the book about simplicity. And so, that's things that are beneficial, that are focused, that are salient, empathetic, minimal. Um, this basically violated all of them, right? And the beneficial one, so this is like sales marketing 101. We buy benefits, we don't buy features, right? We don't care what the thing is, we care what it does for us. If you watch their video, the first like 90 seconds of this, like also too long video, it's not minimal, right? It's like 10 minutes, like, is talking about like the colors it comes in. It's talking about the battery. It's talking about how it attaches to your lapel pin. Before you tells you anything about how this makes your life better, they're getting into the weeds about, oh, well, you put this on here, it's got this magnet on it. And it's completely backwards in terms of how people actually behave. And correspondingly, I mean, I think the reviews for this thing have been absolutely just terrible. I don't want to shit too much on somebody trying to start something and make something interesting, but uh,
No, no, and the
yeah,
most recent one, and I don't mind shitting on these people at all.
yeah.
The most recent one obviously was Budweiser and Dylan Mulvaney. And the minute I saw that, I was kind of like, do you have any clue who buys your product? Do you have any idea who your customer is? Literally at all. Because if you did, you would have never, ever, ever approved this. And I about screamed when their head of product got on national television and said, well, our demographic is too old. Our customer is too old. We need someone younger. And we thought this is the best way to access the younger market. And I'm kind of like, love the energy, wrong younger market. You don't need trans and queer people. You need um you need young men who drive an F-250 and work on an oil rig. Um that's who you need. And they're probably already drinking your product anyway. And if you're having market penetration issues, I would be, advertising on that. And I feel like this is something you could have solved on Facebook or Instagram. I mean, have you tried sponsoring the CMAs? Like there's so many other things you could do to access a younger, find every young country star and press them out some new advertising. But you have now made your brand part of an already hot political discussion and almost collapsed the company in the process with people saying they'll never drink your stuff ever again. I mean, in terms of just like not knowing your audience, that was stunning. It was just so frighteningly scary that they multiple people had to sign off on that to decide, yes, that's the direction you're gonna go in. Okay.
Yeah, I thought that unfortunately that's a campaign that kind of got pulled into it wasn't even a campaign, right? It was like a one influencer post. It was a thing
Yeah.
that got pulled into the culture war in a way which the brand didn't want. And it was also part of that was an opportunistic thing by players in the culture war to make hay out of that, right? So, um,
Oh, certainly,
yeah,
certainly. But I mean, but that's also something where, when if you're a brand and you're going to approach a community that may have some controversy, there's a way to do that. And by the way, Bud White already does that like every gay pride. And I can say that because I am bisexual, I hang out in queer spaces, all this type of thing. Their post was unnecessary. It didn't serve the goal and it dropped their stock 25% in a day, sort of
yeah.
thing. Um, but that was something where it just in terms of like when you do something like that and there's things get coded certain ways, and this happens particularly to products, if you wear Birkenstocks and drive a Subaru, you're probably a lesbian. Subaru has just decided they make cars for lesbians. That's become a huge part of their brand, is like, yes, if you are a lesbian, we have got the automobile for you. And I'm not their customer because I am a dude and I drive a Subaru. But like I used, in fact, when I did stand up in gay clubs, I would joke, I knew I was at the right place when I saw 50 Subarus parked outside. Because that means the lesbians had arrived. And they all have dog crates in the back and dog barriers and all this type of thing. Um, and so I mean I think there's a way to 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 do that and engage that in a very narrow way that doesn't kind of affect your broader audience.
Hmm.
And I feel like it was just such a huge, it was one of those things where it's kind of like if you had stepped outside into the street and talked to 10 people for 5 minutes on your lunch, you would have figured out this was probably a terrible idea, sort of thing. um and I kind of look at it as kind of like the wow, okay. Also, have you read a news headline? Because they did that right as that debate was really peaking and it was really becoming a thing. And there was a lot of, it's kind of like, have you opened Apple News today at
Hmm.
all? Sort of thing. And so I sometimes wonder, and maybe you can address this having worked on the inside. Um, like sometimes I wonder if these people live in reality. Because as someone who covers the news and all this sort of thing and talks to people about their books and all this type of thing, it sometimes feels like the people who make these decisions are a little out of touch.
Well, so what happens when you have a brand like Bud Light or Budweiser, is that it is so ubiquitous that you don't really have a target market in many ways.
True.
You basically your target market is America, and so
Right.
and you're right. It probably does skew certain to a certain part of the political spectrum. It probably skews a certain part of the geography of America. But for the most part, I mean, Bud Light as the number one beer in America, target market was America, right? So it's actually really hard to do that. Like Coca Cola, being Disney, being Apple, being the NFL, are actually it's kind of hard to do the marketing for those things because one of the strongest positions you can do in marketing and messaging um, is to say we're for X, not for Y, right? We are for
Right.
this group, but not for that group. You don't have to explicitly say it, and there's moments where this makes sense and doesn't make sense. But
Yeah.
by saying we're for some people, it's okay that some people don't like our product. We're not the best for you all the time, right? IKEA just did a campaign. I think the IKEA out of actually it might have been like their UAE office or their Middle East division did a campaign that was proudly second best. And I really loved it because basically what it showed like a high chair and the high chair being empty and like half off the frame was like the kid eating off of the lap of the parent. It showed a crib, but the crib was empty and the baby was like sleeping on the parent's chest or something. And it said, okay, proudly second best. We are not as good as the parent is at doing this stuff, but we're the second best at it. And that's a slight kind of half step removed from what we're talking about. But the idea of saying some people like us, some people don't, or divisive maybe, is actually a really strong way to do marketing. A Cool Whip did this a number of years ago. I can't remember the exact campaign, but they basically were like, not for everybody, right? By being able to say that, you immediately are able to bring more people in, actually, because you can never really be for everybody. But by
Well,
by
that was
saying,
the old Avis and Hertz case study. Hertz
yeah,
was the
we
number
try
one car
harder, right?
company
Yeah.
for, yes, and Avis was
Yeah.
we're second best. We have to try harder, sort of thing.
Hmm.
And then Enterprise ate both of their lunches because 9/11 changed the rental car business. But and they were both too tied to airports. And Enterprise had very wisely built locations in cities around town. And so when 9/11 changed air travel and the rental car market moved, Enterprise cleaned up, and now Enterprise is number one. And yeah, and that's gone. And Hertz is literally going bankrupt. Yes, I mean, kind of be, defining yourself by what you're not can be an excellent way to signal who you're for. And also, especially, I find that's true if you're a brand who is aspirational in some nature. Um,
Hmm.
that's particularly true, I think, for like a Hyundai who wants to, um who wants to, be like, you can have, a great car with all the bells and whistles at a great price, sort of thing. And so this aspirational luxury sort of thing. Um, and how they do their marketing, by different models, you can kind of tell who
Hmm.
their ideal customer um is for, because they're marketing the models at different, the smaller SUVs are for younger people, the larger SUVs are more for families and
Hmm.
all this sort of thing. But even the way they design kind of make it look like it's from the future, all this type of thing, and be like, yes, lots and lots of features and options, very low prices, all this sort of thing. Um, is yeah, I think that definitely works for an aspirational,
Hmm.
you see this a lot in, things targeted to the young professional between 28 and 35 who lives in the city, sort of thing.
Yeah.
And you even see this at the big brands for their entry level models. Like if you're BMW, usually if you're a BMW customer, the first one you buy is a 3 Series. Um, and I've known more than one dude who's almost damn gone bankrupt for, buying a BMW 3 Series at 28, and, their car payment is some terrible astronomical amount and all this sort of thing. But I mean, but that's also, oftentimes BMW will keep that person for a very long time so that you can, very specifically, market that a certain way. It's endlessly fascinating.
There was a related to that a little bit. Nebraska, this is what came to mind. Nebraska had a tourism campaign a couple of years ago that was not for everyone. Right. And I
Yes.
loved it. I love it. And it's like you can admit saying, you know what, we're not for everyone. And that makes that draws people to that in group a lot of times. I had a campaign that never ran that is one of my favorite things I ever did worked on, and it was a pro bono thing. So we in New York City during 2020, obviously we had the pandemic, and it was a massive catastrophe across the world, and it was the epicenter was here at the beginning. But what happened that summer was nobody has space in their apartment, right? So everybody goes outside. Everybody's in the parks, and they're in the parks late. Maybe they're picnicking, maybe they're drinking, and they leave the parks full of trash. And so if you looked at all the parks across New York City, they were just they were all dealing with the same problem: the overflowing garbage cans, litter everywhere, and it was kind of becoming a big mess. There was a rat problem, kind of rising at that moment too. So what I was brought in by a group that was like a kind of a coalition of nonprofit parks groups across the city, and to figure out what like PSA can we make for this problem? How can we what kind of like campaign, signage, sticker, whatever it can be that would address this? And so we were batting around a bunch of different ideas. We eventually landed on something that said, "Real New Yorkers don't litter." Right, and it's like real New Yorkers don't litter, and we loved it. And this was a home run with our client there, because the idea is, especially, I mean, all of us are kind of proud of the places we're in a lot of times. New Yorkers are very proud about being a New Yorker a lot of times. And by saying, I'm in the in group of a New Yorker, what does that in group do? That in group doesn't litter. That in group treats their home kind of with respect, right?
Right.
So by positioning the idea of, well, what do real New Yorkers do? Real New Yorkers don't litter. We were able to kind of deputize everybody to be part of that movement. This campaign was being discussed in May of 2020. If you remember what happened in June of 2020 was we had the George Floyd protests all across the city, all across the country. And right as this campaign was about to launch, it just wasn't the moment for it. It wasn't the moment to say some people are real New Yorkers and some people aren't. Even though we had totally benign intentions and it was something that I think would have landed every other
In
year.
every other moment, it would
In
have been
every other
fine. Yeah.
moment, this wasn't the
Yeah.
moment for it. The client agreed, we agreed, wasn't the moment to do it. And so we scrapped it and it ended up never running. But I actually wrote up a blog post about this a couple of years later to showcase all the stuff that we ended up not running with. But I love this idea of being able to say, people, this is the in group, this is what we do. It's maybe not for everybody, but you don't need to get everybody as part of this, as part of anything you're working on.
Yeah. I mean, I've always as someone for whom advertising is minimally effective, I've always found that whole in-group out-group dynamic to be a little bit awkward. It's incredibly effective. Um in my personal non-professional life. I've always found it to be a little bit weird and awkward. Just because I'm usually I'm a mark ironically I've worked in most of my life in marketing. I am a marketing person's worst nightmare because I am a very practical sort of shopper. Um I'm
I mean,
usually like I have X
yeah.
problem to solve, I need Y thing to fix it, and I want to find something that will do that, sharpish sort of thing.
Mhm.
Um, I don't really ever click on ads unless I'm saving them either to screenshot them because I want to use them for a class or something, or sometimes I get curious about generally something I've never heard of before. But by and large, I scroll past as fast as possible. Um, and so I always pay attention to the ads that even grab my attention. The ones that actually sit down and watch, sort of thing. Because I have been in this industry. I know all the tricks and all the things that they like to do, and so I don't really care to bother. So I always pay attention to the ones where I get caught up. So
I mean,
we're getting close to the end, and you
mm,
kind of went through your five things very quickly, and we never really focus on them because we've just sat here telling stories and all this sort of thing.
mhm.
So make sure to tell us what those five things were from your book about advertising.
So yeah, there's five principles about of effective messaging. I ran through them real quick before, but I'll give you them again. So
Yes.
beneficial. And by the way, the book there's this we're divided in kind of the why and the how. The first half of the book is the why, the second half is the how, and the how are these five principles. It's not a checklist, it's not a rubric, it's not a step-by-step plan, but it's design principles that the better you can follow them, the closer you're going to be to something that's going to land as an effective message. So, first one, beneficial. What does it matter to the receiver? What's in it for them? Uh, Features versus benefits, we talked about. Number two is focused. Are you trying to say one thing or are you trying to say multiple things at once? Is it one idea or is it three ideas in a trench coat?
Mm.
Uh, the third one is salient. Does your message stand out from the noise? Is there a contrast? Is it noticeable? Does it rise to your attention? And the fourth is empathetic. Are you speaking in a language that the audience understands? Are you meeting them where they are in terms of both the literal language, but also their emotions, their motivations, and everything else? And then finally, it's minimal, which is have you cut out everything that isn't important and left only what is? And this is not about minimizing words or pages or seconds. It's about minimizing friction. And so the least amount of friction you have, the more effective it's going to be in terms of getting across. And so the more you can activate on these things, the more you can kind of, get to a point where you have a message that is simple, that is fluent, and that does whatever you want it to do, if it's inform or to persuade or anything in between.
Excellent. Excellent.
Yeah.
No, that's very good. That's very good. And I always think of a lot of, you know, old ads that sometimes were very simple but had a really great impact. One of my favorites when they were introducing the AMC Pacer. it's the oil crisis in the 70s. And so they had decided to go for a car that was short in length by the standards of the 70s, but wider. And to prove how wide it was, they had all these people standing on a ramp, and then they kind of pushed the car out because that car didn't have an engine yet because there was some production drama at AMC, and they had all these people falling off the ramp to show how wide the car was, sort of thing. And AMC was barely hanging on. They had no money, but it was an incredibly effective TV ad. And so when you talk about, kind of getting rid of everything you don't, you can do it. You can get a lot of impact with a very simple sort of thing if you're really dialed in as to what the simple thing needs to be.
Hmm.
you know. And so they figured out their one message was our car is wide but not long, so you can have all the room you're used to with way better gas mileage, again by 1970 standards. And they did that by picking one feature. You don't learn anything else about the car, by the way. Not its gas mileage, how nothing else, just that it's wider than other cars. That's it. But they picked one thing, and the Pacer sold fabulously. They picked one thing because they were poor. They picked one thing and they demonstrated that one thing in a 30-second TV ad, and they sold car. It saved the company very briefly. They failed like 6 years later and got bought by Chrysler. But for that moment, they actually, kind of really made it. And I think so when you talk about, kind of stripping everything away for just, what's the really focused central idea. Um, yeah, there's, many, many such cases, as they would say.
Oh yeah.
So, but
By the way, before we go,
yeah.
most people, everybody says that advertising doesn't work on them, um, but I see you're wearing, Apple AirPod, headphones, and we're talking on Zoom, and so we all think advertising doesn't work, but we all, wear deodorant, and we all use Listerine, and we all use, all these different things that, to your point, we're at some point, um, kind of manufactured desires, manufactured needs, manufactured wants that we didn't have when you said, the developers left the programming, 100,000 years ago.
Well, I mean, that's true. We're not living in huts in the savannah now, are
Yeah.
we? Um, and we're not still riding in the horse and buggy now, are we?
Hmm.
Um, Certainly. That is absolutely 110%, 110% true. I think it's something where I think the thing where I struggle is I don't understand, like, and I think it's because my parents are this way. I don't necessarily like, if I wasn't in the market for headphones, would advertising that to me motivate me in any meaningful way to go buy them? Probably not, sort of thing, you know? And I think that's one of the ways in which marketing is changing. In fact, I just was talking, we just reposted a video on TikTok, they were talking about how Gen Z's broke the marketing funnel. And now it's about researching and exploring before you make a purchase decision. The old-fashioned, squeeze pages and funnels aren't going to work on younger people
Hmm.
because they want to kind of find stuff on their own, and they kind of want, they want to compare, they want to talk to their friends, all this type of thing. And millennials started many of these trends. Gen Z is firmly cemented in them. And I find weirdly enough, that's very similar to my buying process. When I figure out I need X, Y, and Z, I then start looking around for, okay, who makes that thing? And what are people saying? And yeah, and of course, by this time, my browser has picked up information and I start seeing ads and all this sort of thing. And we're off to the, races. And, anybody who's trying to sell testosterone replacement or dick pills will advertise to anyone that has a male demographic marker, sort of thing, by any means necessary. Um, Email, social media, any means necessary. Same with adult companies, any means necessary. And so I find it's much more about, I want to do my research, I want to do some exploring, I want to find out what's going to work for me and my use cases. And then and price a lot, especially young people, we don't have a lot of money, and so we're very price sensitive. And companies are figuring out young people are extremely price sensitive because we poll. And so I that's how I kind of like to do it.
Hmm.
I can't think of a time where I have bought something I wasn't already looking for because of advertising.
Yeah.
But I've known people that are like that. I had a boss years ago. We would watch TV and he'd be like, "That's really cool. I should get that." I'm like, "You are an advertising person's dream." There's been 5 ads in a row, and they've sold you every single time. Like, there's some marketing exec that
Awesome.
loves you. Um, and yeah, it's just kind of, I don't know. It's a weird sort of thing. But I think that's emblematic of how things are shifting. So now it's more about come in, check us out, see if we're right for you, as opposed to the old method, I think. What do you think about that? And then we'll go.
I think that there's a saying about propaganda, which is that I'm going to butcher it, which is basically, we all think propaganda, we all think we're immune to propaganda, but we're not, right? Like, and that's
Yeah.
the same thing when it comes to advertising. I think that there are varying degrees of the efficacy of it, but ultimately, it's really hard to escape it. And actually, one thing I try to do. I this book is not something that is an advertising book. It is something that will live in the marketing shelf, but I like to argue that we're all kind of in the business of marketing. If we're an entrepreneur, if we're a leader in our organization, if we're an advocate, if we're a politician, if we're an educator, a faith leader, anything in between, we all have some sort of communication task in what we're doing. And this book is really kind of designed to be something that is going to help us get better at that. And so that's it. That's what I'm looking at is that we're all kind of in the marketing world now. And if anybody, by the way, if anybody's interested in checking it out, simply put, why clear messages win and how to design them, you can get it wherever books are sold. If you go to my site, bengutman.com, two T's and two N's. It's not a great name for radio. I get it. But if you go there, you'll see you can download a free chapter of it. You can sign up for my newsletter, all that good stuff.
No, no, I was just about to ask
Yeah.
you to tell us where we can find you online and keep track
Yeah.
of you and buy the book, and you've done my job for me. So excellent.
Fantastic.
Yes, yeah, no, your German family would have arrived with it being Gutmann with an umlaut over the U, and your name's been anglicized, but it's okay. Well, all right. Well, thank you for coming on the Cameron Journal podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Cameron. It's been a blast.
That's all for this episode of the Cameron Journal podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Visit us online at CameronJournal.com. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and I love to talk to my followers and listeners, so please feel free to get us on social media at Cameron Cowan on Twitter, and we'll see you next time on the Cameron Journal podcast.